My name is Naomi. I am 34 years old and I work as a forensic accountant. I found my 7-year-old son curled up on the cold laundry room floor, pale and shaking from hunger. My mother just sipped her wine and told me that feeding him was a waste of good food because he was not real family. When my parents deliberately starved my adopted son, they forgot one crucial detail. I knew exactly where every single cent of their money was hidden. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your chosen family from toxic blood relatives. The nightmare began on a Thursday afternoon. I was rushing back from an emergency forensic audit in Chicago, my mind buzzing with corporate fraud data. I had been forced to leave town for exactly 48 hours. My regular nanny called in sick at the absolute last minute, leaving me completely stranded. In a moment of sheer desperation, I asked my parents Harold and Barbara to watch my son Leo. Leo is my heart and soul. I adopted him from the foster care system 3 years ago. He is a sweet, somewhat shy boy of Asian descent, with a smile that lights up any room. But to my parents, who are obsessed with high society status and maintaining their pristine image in their wealthy suburban neighborhood, Leo was nothing more than an unwanted accessory. They never approved of my decision to become a single mother through adoption. They made their disdain clear in subtle ways, but I never imagined their prejudice would escalate to physical harm. I pulled my car into their sweeping circular driveway, the tires crunching against the perfectly manicured gravel. Their sprawling brick mansion looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. I hurried up the front steps and unlocked the heavy mahogany door with the emergency key they gave me years ago. The house was completely silent. There was no sound of cartoons playing, no childish laughter, no clatter of toys. I called out for Leo, dropping my overnight bag in the grand foyer. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock answered me. Panic, cold and sharp, began to pool in my stomach. I walked through the immaculate living room, then the spotless gourmet kitchen. Everything was in perfect order, untouched. Then I heard it, a soft, weak whimper coming from the back hallway. I sprinted toward the sound, throwing open the door to the utility and laundry room. The space was freezing, the air conditioning cranked down to an uncomfortable chill. There, huddled in the corner between the washing machine and a stack of folded towels, was Leo. My breath caught in my throat. He was curled into a tight little ball, hugging his knees to his chest. His skin was frighteningly pale and his lips were dry and cracked. When I dropped to my knees and pulled him into my arms, his small body felt completely limp. He was shivering violently, his eyes half closed and unfocused. I asked him what was wrong, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and rising fury. He looked up at me, his voice barely a whisper, and told me he was so hungry and his stomach hurt. He said Grandma told him to stay out of the way and not to touch anything in the kitchen. I scooped him up, holding his fragile weight against my chest. My heart hammered fiercely against my ribs. I carried him out of the freezing laundry room and marched straight toward the back patio, following the sound of classical music. I found my mother Barbara lounging on a designer wicker sofa. She was wearing a silk blouse, her hair perfectly styled, casually sipping a glass of expensive white wine while flipping through a fashion catalog. The afternoon sun caught the heavy diamond rings on her fingers. I demanded to know what she had done to my son. I screamed the words, my voice echoing across the pristine landscaping. Barbara did not even flinch. She slowly lowered her magazine, took a leisurely sip of her wine, and looked at me with an expression of profound irritation. She told me to stop being so dramatic. I stared at her entirely, unable to comprehend the absolute lack of empathy in her eyes. I asked her when Leo had last eaten. She sighed, swirling the wine in her glass. She stated with chilling casualness that he was just a visitor, not our actual blood. She told me she saves the expensive organic food for Stella's kids, my sister's biological children. She looked directly at Leo, who was whimpering against my shoulder, and declared that it was a waste of good food to feed him. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of her words paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. She had deliberately starved a 7-year-old boy for 2 days simply because he did not share her DNA. She had treated my son like an unwanted pest, locking him away in a cold room while she drank wine in the sun. I did not scream again. I did not cry. The fiery rage inside me instantly crystallized into something cold, calculating, and absolute. The forensic accountant in me took complete control. I tightened my grip on Leo. I looked Barbara dead in the eye, stripping every ounce of daughterly affection from my voice. I told her to remember that she said that. I turned my back on her and carried my son through the house, walking out the front door without a single backward glance. I strapped him inside the car. A text arrived from my father Harold. It read, "Do not make a scene. By the way, I need you to sign off on Stella's corporate tax write-off by this coming Friday afternoon." The drive to the emergency room was a blur of frantic lane changes and gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Every few seconds I glanced in the rearview mirror to check on Leo. He was slumped against his car seat, his eyes fluttering, unable to stay awake. The moment I pulled up to the emergency entrance, I threw the car into park, scooped him into my arms, and ran through the sliding glass doors. I shouted for help, and the triage nurses sprang into action immediately. They took one look at his pale, sunken face and rushed us back into a private examination bay. The next hour was the most terrifying period of my life. A team of doctors and nurses swarmed around the narrow hospital bed. They pricked his tiny finger for blood tests, their faces growing grim as the results registered on their monitors. The attending physician pulled me aside, his voice hushed but urgent. He confirmed my worst fears. Leo was suffering from severe hypoglycemia and acute dehydration. His blood sugar levels had plummeted to a dangerously low point, causing the lethargy and shaking. The doctor explained that a child of his age and size needed consistent nutritious meals, and the complete lack of food and water over the past 48 hours had put his organs under immense stress. Watching the nurses insert an intravenous line into the back of his small bruised hand broke my heart. Leo flinched and let out a soft cry, but he was too weak to fight them. As the clear fluid of the saline drip began to rehydrate his frail body, I sat in the stiff plastic chair beside his bed, holding his free hand. I smoothed his dark hair back from his forehead, whispering promises that he was safe now, that I would never let anyone hurt him again. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, a steady reminder of how close I had come to losing him. My phone buzzed violently in my purse, shattering the quiet sanctuary of the hospital bay. I pulled it out and saw my father's name flashing on the screen. Harold, the man who had sat by idly while his wife starved his grandson. I stepped out into the busy, brightly lit hospital corridor, my blood boiling. I answered the call, fully prepared to unleash my fury. Harold did not even bother to say hello. He did not ask where I was or if Leo had survived the ordeal. His voice was sharp, impatient, and dripping with corporate arrogance. He demanded to know why I was ignoring my email notifications. He yelled that he needed my certified signature on the quarterly tax filings for Stella's company immediately. He complained that her vendors were demanding payment and that my delay was costing their family business crucial leverage. I gripped the phone so tightly the plastic casing creaked. I told him he was a monster. I told him that I was standing in an emergency room watching doctors pump fluids into my child because he and Barbara had deliberately starved him. I informed him, with absolute icy precision, that I was going to call the police the moment I hung up. I told him I was filing formal charges for severe child neglect and child endangerment. Harold did not gasp. He did not apologize. Instead, he let out a dark, condescending chuckle. The sound of it made my stomach churn. He told me to go ahead and try. He told me that I was a paranoid, overworked single mother. He asked me, his tone laced with absolute venom, who I thought the police would believe. He painted the picture clearly for me. The authorities would have to choose between respected, wealthy grandparents living in a pristine mansion or the unstable woman who abandoned her kid to go on a business trip. He was gaslighting me with the practiced ease of a corporate predator. He twisted the narrative, framing my emergency forensic audit as an act of negligent abandonment. He claimed that Leo had arrived at their house already sick, that I had dumped a dying child on their doorstep because I cared more about my career than my adopted son. He told me that if I dared to involve the authorities, he would hire the most expensive, ruthless lawyers in the city. He threatened to use their vast wealth and social influence to prove I was an unfit mother. He promised to have Leo permanently removed from my custody and thrown back into the foster care system. The blackmail was sudden and brilliantly wicked. Harold laid out his terms with absolute clarity. He told me to log onto my computer, verify the fake expenses, and commit the tax fraud necessary to keep Stella's failing luxury brand afloat. If I signed the papers and secured their $150,000 write-off, they would forget this little misunderstanding ever happened. If I refused, they would destroy my life and take my son. I ended the call without giving him an answer. I leaned against the cold, sterile wall of the hospital corridor, my mind racing. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to look at liabilities, assets, and leverage. My parents thought their wealth made them untouchable. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea that they had just handed a trained financial investigator the motive to obliterate their entire empire. I walked back into the examination bay, my resolve hardening into solid steel. Leo was finally sleeping peacefully, a faint hint of color returning to his cheeks. I sat beside him, gently resting my hand over his. I swore a silent oath right then and there. I was going to take everything from them. Suddenly, the heavy privacy curtain of our hospital bay was pulled back. I looked up, ready to defend my son against whatever intrusion was coming. A tall, sharply dressed African-American man walked into the space. He was wearing a pristine white doctor's coat, a stethoscope draped around his neck. He stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on the thick stack of medical charts attached to Leo's clipboard. It was Terrence, Stella's husband, my brother-in-law, and a highly respected pediatrician at this exact hospital. Terrence slowly lowered the medical chart, his jaw tight with barely suppressed emotion, and locked his eyes directly onto mine. Terrence did not say a word at first. He turned to the attending emergency room physician and stated with absolute authority that he was taking over as the primary physician on record. The attending doctor recognized him, immediately nodded with professional respect, and stepped back. Terrence moved quickly to the computer terminal mounted in the corner of the medical bay. I watched his fingers fly across the keyboard with focused purpose. He was not just updating a routine hospital chart. He was meticulously building a fortress of medical evidence. He narrated his clinical notes aloud, making sure every detail was officially logged into the secure hospital network. He documented the severe hypoglycemia, the acute dehydration, the dangerous electrolyte imbalances, and the undeniable physical signs of sustained neglect. He established an indisputable medical timeline. He noted the biological markers proving Leo's condition was the direct result of starvation occurring precisely over the last 48 hours, the exact window my son was in the sole custody of Harold and Barbara. He categorized the injuries officially as malicious withholding of nourishment by temporary caregivers. By the time he finished typing and digitally signing his name, he had created a legally binding document that no expensive lawyer could ever erase. He closed the laptop with a sharp click, gave Leo a reassuring smile, and motioned for me to follow him. We stepped out of the examination bay and walked down the brightly lit corridor until we reached a secluded alcove near the break room. Terrence leaned heavily against the wall and let out a long, exhausted breath. The fatigue etched into his features was profound, carrying the heavy weight of silent suffering. He looked at me, his dark eyes filled with a potent mixture of deep sorrow and burning anger. He told me he knew exactly what they had done. He knew what my parents were capable of because he had been living in his own private hell with them for years. I stood there completely stunned as Terrence began to unravel the pristine image of his marriage to my sister Stella. He told me about the relentless microaggressions he endured from Harold and Barbara, on a weekly basis. Despite being a highly successful board-certified pediatrician who essentially bankrolled their lavish lifestyle, they never truly accepted him. He described the covert racism that poisoned every family dinner. Harold constantly referring to him as one of the good ones or making snide comments about his cultural background. Barbara adamantly refusing to display any photographs of his side of the African American family in their sprawling mansion, completely erasing his heritage from their home as if he were nothing more than a convenient cash machine. But the emotional abuse and prejudice were only half the story. Terrence lowered his voice, checking the hallway to make sure no one was listening. He revealed that Stella had been systematically draining their joint bank accounts. He had recently audited their personal finances and discovered that his wife was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into Harold and Barbara's private accounts. My parents were completely broke. Their entire wealthy suburban facade was an illusion funded entirely by the money Stella was stealing from her own husband. Terrence had been working grueling 80-hour weeks at the hospital, saving diligently for his twin daughters' college funds, only to find out Stella had been secretly transferring that exact money to cover my parents' country club memberships and designer wardrobes. My forensic accountant instincts flared instantly at the mention of stolen funds. I immediately told Terrence about the phone call I just had with Harold. I explained the vicious blackmail, the demand for me to sign off on a fraudulent $150,000 corporate tax write-off for Stella's failing luxury brand, and the threat to take Leo away from me if I refused to commit federal tax evasion. Terrence did not look surprised by their depravity. He looked absolutely lethal. He told me he was done playing the supportive son-in-law. He was done letting them bleed him dry while they treated him like a second-class citizen. He was done watching them abuse a defenseless boy just to assert their dominance and protect their fake reputation. We stood in that quiet hospital hallway and looked at each other with perfect clarity. No words were needed to solidify the agreement. We formed a silent, unbreakable pact right then and there. I had the financial expertise required to tear apart their fraudulent corporate empire, and Terrence had the irrefutable medical evidence and his own financial records to bury them legally. We were going to dismantle Harold, Barbara, and Stella piece by piece. We were going to take everything they loved, expose their crimes, and leave them with nothing. With our alliance forged, we walked back down the corridor toward the main waiting area to finalize Leo's discharge paperwork. As we approached the central nurses' station, the sliding glass doors of the emergency department hissed open violently. A severe-looking woman in a sharp gray suit walked into the room with aggressive purpose. She carried a thick clipboard and wore an official badge around her neck. She bypassed the busy triage line and marched directly up to the head charge nurse. Her voice was loud, carrying clearly across the tense waiting room. She announced that she was an investigator with State Child Protective Services. She stated she was responding to a high-priority emergency tip regarding severe child endangerment and criminal neglect, and she demanded to speak with Naomi immediately. My blood ran ice-cold as the reality crashed over me. Barbara had not just made an empty, cruel threat over the phone. She had actually called the government to accuse me of child abuse, attempting to steal my son and force my total compliance. The woman in the sharp gray suit marched directly toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor of the hospital waiting room. She held up her badge, introducing herself as Agent Davis from State Child Protective Services. Her voice was loud and commanding, deliberately designed to intimidate. She informed me that she had received a high-priority anonymous tip claiming I had abandoned my 7-year-old son to go on a vacation, leaving him completely neglected and resulting in his current hospitalization. She stated that unless I could provide an immediate and satisfactory explanation, she was authorized to take Leo into emergency state custody tonight. A normal mother might have broken down in tears or panicked at the threat of losing her child. But I was not just a mother. I was a certified fraud examiner. My entire career was built on dismantling lies, tracking hidden assets, and destroying false narratives using cold, hard data. The moment Agent Davis threatened my family, the terrified mother vanished, and the forensic accountant took the wheel. My pulse steadied. My mind cleared. I looked at the CPS investigator with absolute unwavering calm. I did not raise my voice or act defensive. I simply gestured toward an empty family consultation room down the hall and told her we should discuss this matter in private. Once we were inside, I sat at the heavy wooden table, opened my laptop, and pulled up my encrypted files. I told Agent Davis that whoever made that anonymous call was about to face severe legal consequences for filing a false report and committing perjury. I turned my screen toward her. I presented my first piece of evidence. I showed her the official time-stamped email from my regular nanny calling in sick at 4 in the morning on Tuesday. Next, I pulled up my corporate flight itinerary complete with digital boarding passes, hotel receipts, and corporate expense reports, proving I was mandated by my firm to fly to Chicago for an emergency financial audit. I established a bulletproof timeline highlighting the exact hour I dropped Leo off at my parents' sprawling estate and the precise minute I returned 48 hours later. Agent Davis scrutinized the screen, her aggressive demeanor faltering slightly. She pointed out that leaving a child with grandparents was not a crime, but the child ending up malnourished in a hospital was entirely my responsibility as the primary caregiver. I smiled a cold, predatory smile. I told her she was absolutely right about the responsibility, which was exactly why I was pressing charges against the temporary caregivers. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I opened the text message thread with my mother, Barbara. I handed the device directly to the investigator. I told her to read the message my mother sent me just moments before I rushed Leo to the emergency room. Agent Davis took the phone. I watched her eyes scan the glowing screen. I watched the color literally drain from her face. She read the words Barbara had typed with such careless cruelty. She read the part where my mother explicitly stated that Leo was just a visitor and not their actual blood. She read the horrific admission where Barbara declared she saved the expensive organic food for her biological grandchildren and that feeding my adopted son was a waste of good food. The investigator was speechless, but I was not finished. I swiped to the next message. I showed her the text from my father Harold. I let her read his blatant attempt at extortion. She read his demand for me to sign off on a fraudulent $150,000 corporate tax write-off for my sister Stella. She read his explicit threat to use his wealth and high-priced lawyers to frame me as an unfit mother and throw Leo back into the foster care system if I refused to commit federal tax evasion for his company. Agent Davis slowly placed the phone back on the table. The aggressive posture she had walked in with was completely gone, replaced by profound professional shock. Before she could even formulate a response, the heavy wooden door of the consultation room swung open. Terrence stepped inside, still wearing his pristine white doctor's coat. He carried a thick, legally binding medical file. He introduced himself to the investigator as the primary attending pediatrician on record for Leo, and also as the brother-in-law of the accused. Terrence did not mince words. He spoke with the commanding authority of a highly respected medical professional. He placed the medical chart directly in front of Agent Davis. He explained the undeniable biology of severe hypoglycemia and acute dehydration. He pointed to the specific blood test results, the crashing glucose levels, and the dangerous electrolyte panels. He stated on the official medical record that Leo had arrived at his grandparents' house in perfectly healthy condition. Terrence provided irrefutable medical evidence that the starvation and dehydration strictly occurred during the exact 48-hour window that Leo was in the sole custody of Harold and Barbara. Terrence looked the CPS worker dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow. He stated that as a mandated reporter, he was officially filing a medical report of severe child endangerment, malicious neglect, and physical abuse against Harold and Barbara. He made it clear that any attempt to frame Naomi for this crime would be met with the full force of the hospital's legal department. The silence in the consultation room was absolute. Agent Davis looked from the medical charts to the horrifying text messages and then up at Terrence and me. We had boxed her into a corner using flawless documentation and indisputable science. The false narrative my parents had carefully constructed was instantly obliterated. Agent Davis let out a long, heavy breath. She closed her clipboard and stood up. She apologized to me directly, stating that the agency had a legal obligation to follow up on the tip, but it was abundantly clear that the call was a malicious retaliatory act. She officially declared on the record that she was immediately dropping the entire investigation into me. I was completely cleared of any wrongdoing. But she did not stop there. Agent Davis picked up her pen, her expression hardening into righteous fury. She informed us that she was immediately opening a high-priority criminal inquiry into Harold and Barbara. She stated she would be contacting the local police department to coordinate an investigation into felony child neglect, child endangerment, and filing a false report to a government agency. She promised us that my parents would be held fully accountable for what they had done to my son. She thanked Terrence for the medical files, shook my hand firmly, and marched out of the room to make her phone calls. The threat was neutralized. My parents' attempt to destroy my family had backfired spectacularly, triggering a criminal investigation against themselves. The door clicked shut, leaving Terrence and me alone in the quiet consultation room. The adrenaline was still pumping fiercely through my veins. We had won the first battle, but the war was just beginning. I looked at Terrence, expecting him to be relieved. Instead, his dark eyes were burning with intense, focused determination. He reached into the deep pocket of his white doctor's coat. He pulled out a small, heavy metal flash drive. It looked like a military-grade encrypted storage device. He stepped closer to me, glancing toward the hallway to ensure we were completely alone. He placed the cold metal drive directly into the palm of my hand and closed my fingers around it. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a dangerous kind of resolve. He told me he pulled these files directly from a hidden safe in Stella's home office while she was out getting her nails done. He looked at me, the silent pact between us cementing into absolute warfare. Follow the money. Follow the money. Those 3 words echoed in my mind the entire drive back to my apartment. I had Leo securely fastened in the back seat, finally sleeping a deep, restorative sleep after the hospital staff stabilized his blood sugar. Carrying him upstairs to his bedroom felt like carrying the most precious cargo on earth. I tucked him under his favorite heavy quilt, adjusted the thermostat to keep the room perfectly warm, and stood in the doorway just watching his chest rise and fall. He was safe. Now it was time to go to war. I walked into my home office and locked the door. I turned on all 3 of my high-resolution monitors, brewed a pot of black coffee, and plugged Terrence's heavy metal flash drive into my secure terminal. As a certified fraud examiner, I am accustomed to digging through complex corporate obfuscations. Stella and my parents were not criminal masterminds. They were just arrogant. Stella had protected the primary folders with a basic password. It took my decryption software less than 4 minutes to crack it. The password was her own birthday. Typical. The moment the root directory opened, a massive web of financial data spilled across my screens. Bank statements, tax returns, wire transfer receipts, and hidden ledgers. I began sorting the files chronologically, establishing a baseline of their cash flow. What I found within the first hour of digging made my blood run cold. It was not just the sheer volume of money they were moving. It was the blatant documented proof of how utterly worthless I was to them compared to my sister. I opened a folder labeled Personal Liabilities. Staring right back at me were scanned copies of my old college financial aid applications. I remembered sitting at their pristine kitchen table a decade ago, begging them to co-sign my student loans so I could finish my accounting degree. They had looked at me with absolute disdain and refused, claiming they needed to teach me financial independence. I had to work 3 grueling jobs waitressing until 2 in the morning just to afford my textbooks and tuition. Yet directly beneath my rejection letters was a master spreadsheet detailing Stella's entrepreneurial ventures. The numbers were staggering. Harold and Barbara had funneled over $400,000 into Stella's various failed business attempts. There were wire transfers to cover the rent for a high-end boutique she abandoned after 6 months. There were massive checks written to clear the debts of a luxury event planning company she drove into the ground. They had essentially laundered hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake consulting fees to keep Stella living in the lap of luxury while I was starving on a college campus. They did not want to teach me independence. They simply wanted to hoard their resources for their biological golden child. I pushed the personal betrayal aside and channeled that anger directly into the corporate files. I opened the master ledger for Harold's primary business holdings. My parents projected the image of untouchable suburban elites. They hosted extravagant charity galas, drove imported luxury vehicles, and looked down their noses at anyone who earned a standard paycheck. But the spreadsheets told the real story. Harold was not a wealthy titan of industry. He was a desperate drowning man. I traced the corporate cash flow and uncovered a massive fragile house of cards. His company was heavily leveraged, suffocating under high-interest commercial loans that he had secured using falsely inflated asset valuations. But the real crime, the one that would guarantee federal prison time, was his tax evasion. I found the shadow ledgers. Harold had been systematically skimming profits from his company, routing the money through offshore accounts and reporting catastrophic losses to the Internal Revenue Service for the past 7 years. He owed the federal government over $1 million in unpaid back taxes and penalties. One single anonymous tip to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and Harold would be trading his tailored suits for a federal prison uniform. I documented every single fraudulent transaction. I took screenshots, downloaded the ledgers, and backed up the evidence to 3 separate highly encrypted cloud servers. I was building an execution block, and Harold had provided all the rope. But the deeper I dug into their financial web, the more erratic their recent money movements became. The business accounts were drained. Stella was bleeding Terrence dry, just as he had suspected, transferring his hard-earned pediatric salary to cover Harold's massive loan interest payments. They were running out of cash, shuffling money from one credit line to another just to keep the lights on in their mansion. I initiated a comprehensive credit sweep across their entire local network, running a deep diagnostic on every social security number associated with their household to see exactly how much debt they were hiding. The progress bar crawled across my monitor as the software pulled data from the major credit bureaus. The results populated on my screen one by one. Harold, Barbara, Stella, Terrence, all of them carrying massive, suffocating debt loads. Then a final file generated at the bottom of the list. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the name on the official credit report. It was not an adult. It was Leo, my adopted son, a 7-year-old boy. My hands started to shake as I clicked open the file. I stared at the data, the pure, unadulterated evil of it washing over me. Someone in that house had taken my son's social security number, a number I had provided to them years ago for an emergency medical form, and used it to open a secret high-limit credit card. The account was completely maxed out. They had racked up exactly $40,000 in luxury purchases, designer clothes, and fine dining under the identity of a first grader. The same child they had locked in a freezing laundry room and starved for 2 days because he was a waste of food. The screen blurred as red-hot rage erupted. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. I did not scream into the empty apartment. Instead, I let the ice-cold precision of my profession take over completely. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct emergency fraud line for the major credit bureaus. As a certified fraud examiner, I knew exactly which federal statutes to quote and which rapid response protocols to trigger. Within 15 minutes, I had placed a permanent, impenetrable security freeze on Leo's social security number. I flagged the $40,000 credit account as a malicious Tier 1 identity theft crime. Then I began compiling the dossier. I traced every single transaction on that maxed-out card. The purchases were sickeningly predictable. $5,000 at a luxury boutique in downtown Chicago. $2,000 for a VIP weekend at a high-end day spa. $3,000 for premium catered meals. This was not Harold trying to save his failing company. This was Stella funding her delusion of grandeur using the identity of a starved 7-year-old boy. I downloaded the itemized receipts, the digital signatures, and the IP addresses used to authorize the online transactions. I built an airtight federal-level criminal file. Right as I was categorizing the final fraudulent charge, my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID flashed Stella's name. I took a slow, deep breath, centering myself. I tapped the record button on my secondary audio capture software and answered the call. Stella did not ask about Leo. She did not ask if my son was recovering from the severe dehydration and hypoglycemia our mother had caused. She bypassed basic human decency entirely and launched straight into her own narcissistic agenda. She demanded to know why I had not officially RSVP'd to her brand launch gala next weekend. Her voice was shrill, laced with that familiar grating entitlement. She told me that as her sister, I was absolutely obligated to support her entrepreneurial journey. She insisted that I go online immediately and purchase the $500 VIP ticket. She claimed that the event was almost sold out to Chicago's absolute elite, and she was doing me a massive favor by saving me a seat. I kept my voice perfectly flat, stripping away every ounce of the venom coursing through my veins. I told her I was just checking my finances because I had noticed a rather large discrepancy on a credit report. I played the part of the confused, overwhelmed single mother flawlessly. I injected just enough hesitation into my voice to make her feel vastly superior. I asked her, keeping my tone mild and inquisitive, if she or our parents knew anything about a high-limit credit card opened under Leo's social security number. Stella let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. She did not deny it. She did not even attempt to hide her crime. She actually sounded annoyed that I was bringing it up. She told me I was making a massive deal out of absolutely nothing. She brazenly admitted that they had just borrowed the number to float some essential upfront expenses for her gala. She laughed a short, callous sound and told me that Leo is only 7 years old and he does not have credit anyway. She argued that he was not even using his social security number, so it was perfectly fine for the family to put it to good use. She explicitly stated that once her luxury lifestyle brand took off after the gala, she would pay off the $40,000, and I would not even notice it was gone. I smiled at my monitors. I had her. I had a crystal-clear recorded admission of felony identity theft, wire fraud, and credit card fraud directly tied to a minor. I told her, my voice dripping with manufactured submission, that I understood completely. I promised her I would log on and buy the $500 VIP ticket right away. I assured her I would not miss her launch gala for the world. Stella sounded immensely satisfied. She told me to wear something appropriate so I would not embarrass the family in front of their wealthy investors, and then she hung up. She had no idea she had just handed me the final nail for her own coffin. I saved the audio file, backed it up to my encrypted cloud servers, and attached it directly to the identity theft dossier. The trap was fully set. Stella and my parents felt completely secure, believing I was successfully bullied back into my usual submissive role. With the criminal evidence locked away, I pivoted back to their financial ruin. Terrence's files had shown that Harold's corporate facade was crumbling, but I needed the exact leverage to crush them physically. I needed their sanctuary. I needed the deed to their sprawling, pristine suburban mansion. I pulled up my encrypted contact list and found the private number of David, a ruthless, distressed debt broker I frequently collaborated with during complex corporate liquidations. David dealt in toxic assets, buying and selling the defaulted loans of desperate millionaires. I dialed his direct line. When he answered, I skipped the pleasantries. I gave him the exact address of my parents' Lake Forest estate. I told him I had traced their primary mortgage to a specific aggressive shadow hedge fund operating out of New York. I asked David to pull the back-end financial data on that exact property. I needed to know exactly how many months Harold was in default, and more importantly, I needed to know the exact discounted cash price the hedge fund would accept to quietly sell that toxic mortgage directly to me. I wanted absolute control over their living situation. I wanted the legal authority to stand in their grand foyer and strip them of the very status symbol they valued more than my son's life. David did not ask unnecessary questions. In our line of work, distressed real estate is just another column on a spreadsheet. He told me he would run the algorithms, check the institutional portfolios, and get back to me before the markets closed. I ended the call and immediately opened my personal brokerage accounts. I had spent the last decade building a substantial, highly diversified investment portfolio. I lived well below my means, funneling every spare dollar from my forensic accounting contracts into aggressive growth stocks and municipal bonds. It was my safety net, the ironclad security I had built to ensure Leo would never experience the financial instability I had suffered during college. Now I was going to weaponize it. I clicked the sell orders one by one. I liquidated my mutual funds, cashed out my blue-chip tech stocks, and emptied my high-yield savings accounts. It took less than an hour to convert years of disciplined financial planning into pure liquid capital. I watched the balances transfer into my primary checking account, the numbers swelling into a massive cash reserve. I was ready to buy, but I could not purchase the debt under my own name. If Harold or his frantic defense attorneys traced the transaction back to me before the gala, they could attempt to file injunctions or use the family courts to tie up the eviction process. I needed absolute impenetrable anonymity. I opened my specialized corporate registration software and initiated the rapid formation of a new entity. I chose Wyoming as the state of incorporation, leveraging their strict corporate privacy laws that completely shield the identity of managing members from public records. I named the company Apex Recovery, LLC. I appointed a registered agent, paid the expedited filing fees, and within 2 hours, the shell company was a legally recognized financial institution. I wired my newly liquidated cash directly into the Apex Recovery corporate holding account. I was officially a debt buyer. My secure phone chimed at exactly 4 in the afternoon. It was David. He had located the exact hedge fund holding the primary mortgage on the Lake Forest mansion. He told me the situation was actually much worse than Terrence's initial files had indicated. Harold had not made a single mortgage payment in 9 months. The hedge fund had already classified the multi-million-dollar loan as a toxic, non-performing asset. They were preparing to initiate a lengthy, expensive public foreclosure process, something hedge funds absolutely despise because it drains their quarterly profit margins. David patched me directly through to a senior portfolio manager at the fund. The man sounded exhausted, eager to offload the bad paper before the end of the fiscal quarter. I introduced myself simply as the acting CEO of Apex Recovery, LLC, an aggressive debt acquisition firm specializing in toxic suburban real estate. I kept my voice stripped of all emotion, adopting the ruthless clinical tone of a corporate raider. I laid out the facts for the portfolio manager. I told him I had run an independent forensic analysis on the debtor Harold. I detailed Harold's failing company, his massive commercial liabilities, and his impending tax evasion audit. I painted a grim, entirely accurate picture of a man who would fight the foreclosure in bankruptcy court for years, tying up the hedge fund's capital in endless litigation. I let the silence hang on the line, letting the reality of Harold's financial ruin sink into the portfolio manager's calculations. Then I made my offer. I told him Apex Recovery, LLC, was prepared to wire a lump sum cash payment by the close of business today to purchase the mortgage outright. I offered him exactly 22 cents on the dollar. It was a brutal, predatory, lowball offer. I fully expected him to counter, but the manager just let out a heavy sigh of relief. He admitted the debt was dragging down their entire portfolio metrics. He wanted the liability off his books immediately. He accepted my offer without a single counter-proposal. The digital paperwork arrived in my inbox 10 minutes later. I reviewed the transfer of lien documents, ensuring every legal loophole was sealed shut. I applied my encrypted digital signature as the CEO of Apex Recovery, LLC, and authorized the wire transfer. The funds left my holding account and instantly cleared the hedge fund's routing numbers. I sat back in my desk chair and stared at the final confirmation receipt glowing on my monitors. The feeling of absolute power washed over me, heavy and intoxicating. I was no longer the disowned, unwanted daughter begging for table scraps. I was not the exhausted single mother being blackmailed with tax fraud. I was the bank. I legally owned the deed of trust to the sprawling, pristine mansion my parents used to look down on the rest of the world. They were sleeping in my bedrooms, walking on my hardwood floors, and drinking wine on my patio. And because the loan was already 9 months in default, I possessed the immediate legal authority to bypass the standard grace periods. I could initiate a rapid foreclosure and evict them onto the street with zero warning. I printed the official deed transfer, folded it meticulously, and placed it inside my tailored suit jacket. It was the ultimate trump card resting right over my heart. I was visualizing the exact moment I would drop it onto the floor of Stella's extravagant gala when my phone buzzed violently against the mahogany desk. It was Terrence. I answered immediately, expecting him to be reviewing the divorce filings with our attorney. Instead, his voice was tight, strained with a level of devastation I had never heard from him before. He was struggling to maintain his professional composure, his breath hitching over the receiver. He told me he had just checked the specialized high-yield education accounts he had set up the day his twin daughters were born. He had worked 80-hour weeks at the pediatric ward for years to ensure those girls would have fully funded tuition for any university in the country. Terrence choked on his words, the betrayal destroying his stoic facade. He told me the accounts were empty, every single dollar was gone. Stella had secretly forged his signature, bypassed the dual authorization security, and drained the twins' entire college funds just hours ago. She had stolen her own children's future to pay the final catering and champagne invoices for her fake lifestyle brand launch gala. The line went silent as Stella's betrayal settled over us. Stealing from a spouse was one thing, but robbing her twin daughters of their future to buy cheap champagne crossed a line into pure malice. I told Terrence to breathe. I instructed him to pack a bag for the girls, take them out of that toxic house, and check into a secure hotel under an assumed name. I promised him I had a plan. I grabbed my blazer, locked my office, and told him to meet me in Chicago in exactly 1 hour. We were not going to wait for Stella to drain another cent. We met at the office of Attorney Reynolds. She was the most ruthless divorce lawyer in the city, renowned for dismantling narcissistic spouses in high-net-worth cases. I had worked with her previously as an expert witness, and she owed me. Terrence sat in the plush leather chair opposite her heavy oak desk, looking hollowed out. I sat beside him, opening my laptop to display the financial hemorrhaging I had tracked. Reynolds did not offer empty sympathies. She operated with the same tactical precision I did. I presented the wire transfers showing Stella forging Terrence's signature to empty the college funds. Reynolds drafted an emergency ex parte order to freeze all remaining joint assets. I utilized my forensic access to reroute Terrence's direct deposit from the pediatric hospital into a newly established individual account that Stella could not touch. We locked down his retirement portfolios, flagged his personal credit for fraud, and legally severed his financial identity from his wife. Within 45 minutes, Stella was financially stranded, oblivious that her access to Terrence's wealth had been permanently severed. As Reynolds finalized the emergency injunctions, Terrence leaned forward, resting his face in his hands. The financial theft was devastating, but the emotional betrayal shattered his resolve. He looked up, his dark eyes hardening with a profound, quiet fury. He told us about the incident that happened 2 nights ago at Harold and Barbara's country club. Terrence had attended a dinner to support Stella's networking efforts. During cocktails, Harold was holding court with his wealthy investor friends. Harold thought Terrence was out of earshot. He made a vile, racist joke about Terrence reducing a brilliant, life-saving pediatrician to a disgusting stereotype just to get a laugh from his bigoted country club buddies. Terrence's voice dropped to a near whisper, vibrating with suppressed rage. He said he had frozen in place, waiting for his wife to defend him. He waited for Stella to reprimand her father to stand up for the man who provided her luxurious life to protect the father of her children. Instead, Stella had simply laughed. She threw her head back, sipped expensive champagne, and laughed right along with them, entirely complicit in his degradation. Terence told us that was the moment his marriage died. He realized he was never a husband to her, nor a son-in-law to them. He was just a convenient bank account and a prop they tolerated when it suited their false progressive image. I looked at Terence, feeling a deep, stabilizing kinship. We were both outsiders who had been used, mocked, and discarded by the exact same people. I told him about the foreclosure deed resting in my pocket. I explained that I now legally owned the mansion his racist father-in-law was using to project his fake wealth. Reynolds leaned back in her chair, a predatory smile crossing her face. She asked us how we wanted to serve the divorce papers and the asset freeze notifications. A quiet private delivery was the standard protocol. Terence and I locked eyes. We knew quiet divorce would not work. Stella and my parents thrived exclusively on their public image. Their entire existence was built on projecting a flawless high society facade. We decided that a private settlement would only give them the opportunity to spin the narrative, to play the victims, and to lie to their wealthy friends. We needed to strike where it would inflict the maximum amount of social and financial damage. We needed a venue where they could not hide from the truth. The lifestyle brand launch gala was scheduled for this coming Saturday. It was the perfect, highly publicized stage. Hundreds of Harold's investors, Barbara's socialite friends, and Stella's fake industry connections would be packed into the country club ballroom. We coordinated the ultimate legally binding ambush. I would handle the financial execution and the foreclosure. Terence would handle the marital destruction. We spent another 2 hours mapping out the exact timeline of the gala. Reynolds prepared the physical documents, placing them into a thick manila envelope, ensuring the service of the divorce papers would be a matter of undeniable public record. Terence left the office to return to his daughters at the hotel, his posture straight, the heavy burden of trying to please an unpleasable family finally lifted from his shoulders. I packed up my laptop and drove back to my apartment, my mind racing through the logistical details of our counterstrike. The sun was setting over Chicago as I unlocked my front door. The apartment was quiet, smelling faintly of the dinner the nanny prepared for Leo. I walked into the kitchen to check the mail that had been collected earlier. Sitting right on top of the pile was a thick, heavy envelope made of premium cardstock. It was sealed with a pretentious wax stamp bearing Stella's brand logo. I sliced it open. Inside was an embossed gold invitation to the brand launch gala, practically dripping with unearned arrogance. A small piece of heavy stationery fluttered out and landed on the granite countertop. It was a handwritten note from my mother, Barbara. The cursive handwriting was elegant, completely masking the venom of the words. I picked it up and read the brief, cruel message. It said, "Come see what a real family looks like. Leave the stray at home." I stared at the heavy cardstock in my hand. Leave the stray at home. The sheer audacity of Barbara referring to my beautiful, innocent 7-year-old boy as a stray dog ignited a fire in my chest that burned away any lingering hesitation. They wanted a show. They wanted an audience. I walked over to my laptop, typed in the custom web address printed at the bottom of the embossed invitation, and navigated to the RSVP page. I typed my name with deliberate heavy keystrokes and clicked the button that said, "Yes, I will attend." I was not just attending, I was bringing the entire theater crashing down on their heads. An ambush of this magnitude required flawless logistical execution. Harold and Barbara were incredibly protective of their country club image, and the moment things went south, Harold would undoubtedly try to use physical intimidation or summon the club security to throw Terence and me out. I needed my own tactical advantage. I picked up my phone and contacted a private security firm that specialized in executive protection for corporate whistleblowers. I requested 3 off-duty police officers to act as my personal security detail for the night of the gala. I paid double their standard premium rate to ensure absolute discretion and immediate physical intervention if Harold lost his temper. I gave them specific instructions to wear tailored black suits and to shadow my movements the entire evening. Next, I called Attorney Reynolds to coordinate the delivery of Terrence's divorce papers. Standard process servers would never make it past the country club front desk, let alone the VIP ballroom doors. Reynolds had a specialist for high net worth ambushes, a seasoned process server named David who seamlessly blended into any background. We arranged for David to bypass the guest list entirely. I utilized my connections with a high-end catering vendor I had previously audited to get David slipped onto the country club payroll for a single night. He was going to be stationed behind the main VIP bar, dressed in a crisp white tuxedo shirt and a black bow tie, pouring champagne for my sister's elite guests while keeping the heavy manila envelope containing the divorce papers and asset freeze injunctions hidden perfectly beneath the polished mahogany bar counter. With the tactical trap set, I closed my laptop and walked down the hallway to Leo's bedroom. I pushed the door open quietly. He was sitting cross-legged on his colorful play rug, carefully building a massive tower out of wooden blocks. He looked up when I entered, his dark eyes bright and trusting. The pale, dehydrated ghost I had carried out of my parents' freezing laundry room was gone, replaced by a vibrant, healing boy who felt entirely safe in his own home. I walked over and sat down on the rug right beside him. I pulled him into my lap, wrapping my arms securely around his small frame. He rested his head against my chest, and I kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his lavender shampoo. I looked at my incredible son, thinking about the vile note resting on my kitchen counter. I told him that I loved him more than anything else in this entire world. I told him that family is not about who shares your DNA or who looks exactly like you. I explained, keeping my voice gentle but absolutely firm, that true family is about who protects you, who feeds you, and who stands by your side when the world gets scary. I looked right into his eyes and assured him that he was my true blood. He was my chosen family, and no one would ever be allowed to make him feel small or unwanted ever again. I promised him that I was going out this weekend to cut the monsters out of our lives permanently, locking the door so they could never come back to hurt us. Leo wrapped his arms around my neck and squeezed tightly. He told me he loved me too. The pure, unconditional love radiating from my little boy stood in such staggering, beautiful contrast to the shallow, materialistic cruelty of my parents. They measured human worth in country club memberships and designer labels. I measured it by the warmth of the small arms currently hugging me. Their complete inability to feel genuine love was their greatest weakness, and my fierce love for my son was the armor that made me completely untouchable. I tucked Leo into bed an hour later, reading him 2 extra stories just to hear him laugh. When he was finally asleep, I walked back into my home office to review the final foreclosure documents for Apex Recovery LLC. As I sat down, a new email notification popped up on my primary monitor. The sender was Harold. I clicked it open. The message was dripping with his typical insufferable arrogance. He wrote to boast that I had completely missed my window to ruin him. He bragged that his high-priced corporate accountant had successfully handled the upcoming IRS audit. He claimed they had successfully buried the $150,000 fraudulent tax write-off for Stella's luxury brand deep within a web of offshore consulting fees. He ended the email by telling me I was a foolish little girl who never understood how real wealth operates and that he was entirely untouchable. I stared at the screen, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. Harold's arrogance was truly his greatest liability. He had just put a written confession of premeditated federal tax evasion and offshore money laundering right into my hands. I did not reply to him. I did not need to. I simply clicked the forward button. I attached the complete decrypted financial ledgers I had pulled from Terrence's flash drive, linking Harold's smug confession directly to the hidden offshore accounts. I typed a brief professional note highlighting the exact routing numbers and the fake consulting firm shell companies. I moved my mouse up to the recipient line and addressed the email directly to my elite contacts at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I hit send. Sending that encrypted email to the federal authorities was the prelude. By the time Saturday evening arrived, the trap was locked and inescapable. I pulled up to the valet stand of the elite country club. I did not arrive in a flashy sports car meant to impress my parents' shallow friends. I drove my reliable sedan. I stepped out into the crisp air, smoothing the lapels of my tailored designer suit. It was a power suit chosen specifically for a corporate execution. My hair was pulled back into a sleek style, and I wore no jewelry other than my watch. I was certainly not there to play dress-up. I was there to perform a liquidation. 3 men in dark suits seamlessly fell into step behind me as I walked up the grand stone steps. My hired private security detail moved with the silent, formidable grace of off-duty police officers scanning the perimeter with calculated precision. I handed my invitation to the attendant at the front door. He glanced at my name, glanced at the 3 imposing men flanking me, and opened the double oak doors without a single question. The grand ballroom was an explosion of unearned excess. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of Chicago's wealthiest socialites, venture capitalists, and real estate developers. Waiters in white gloves circulated with silver trays of caviar and top-shelf liquor. It was the kind of pretentious masquerade my parents lived for. The room buzzed with the sound of clinking glasses and arrogant networking, everyone oblivious to the fact that this event was funded by stolen college savings and massive tax fraud. I spotted Harold holding court near the center of the room, puffing on a thick cigar and laughing loudly with a group of naive investors. I made a mental note of their faces. They would all be receiving federal subpoenas soon enough. I bypassed his group and made my way toward the champagne fountain glowing near the back wall. I had barely picked up a crystal flute when I heard the click of Barbara's heels approaching from behind. I turned slowly. My mother was draped in an obnoxious emerald green evening gown, diamonds dripping heavily from her neck and wrists. She looked me up and down, her lip curling into a sneer of absolute disdain. She leaned in close, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for me. She told me I had a lot of nerve showing my face after she told me to leave my stray at home. She asked why I bothered dressing up in a business suit to attend a gala, suggesting I looked like I was here to audit the catering staff rather than celebrate my sister. I did not flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. I looked her dead in the eye and let the forensic accountant take over completely. I kept my voice modulated, chillingly professional. I told her it was funny she mentioned audits. I mentioned that I had been spending time analyzing high-risk asset diversification lately. I threw out the exact name of Harold's fake offshore consulting firm in the Cayman Islands. I watched Barbara's smug expression falter for a fraction of a second. I took a step closer, invading her personal space. I dropped my voice to a clinical corporate whisper. I explained that it is a fascinating phenomenon, how heavily leveraged liabilities can trigger immediate federal tax evasion penalties, especially when individuals attempt to disguise $150,000 write-offs as legitimate business expenses. I mentioned the severe mandatory minimum prison sentences associated with wire fraud and malicious identity theft. I told her that the Internal Revenue Service has a success rate when it comes to piercing corporate veils and seizing primary estates. Barbara's face drained of all color. The emerald green of her designer dress suddenly looked sickly against her pale, trembling skin. Her eyes darted frantically around the crowded room as if expecting federal agents to step out from behind the ice sculptures. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogant, cruel woman who had starved my son in a laundry room was suddenly struggling to breathe under the crushing weight of my calculated corporate jargon. I gave her a cold, empty smile, clinked my glass gently against hers, and told her to enjoy the party while it lasted. I walked away, leaving my mother frozen in panic near the champagne tower. My security detail parted seamlessly to let me through, forming an impenetrable wall. I scanned the massive ballroom and locked eyes with Terrence. He was standing near the front stage, looking incredibly handsome in a sharp black tuxedo. His posture was rigid, but his eyes burned with the same focused, lethal determination as mine. We gave each other a single imperceptible nod. I shifted my gaze to the main VIP bar. There, wiping down the mahogany counter in a crisp white uniform and black bow tie, was David. The elite process server blended in perfectly. He caught my eye and tapped the heavy manila envelope resting beneath the bar counter. The divorce papers and the asset freeze injunctions were primed and ready. The trap was fully armed. At the front of the room, the lights began to dim. A hush fell over the wealthy crowd as a spotlight illuminated the main stage. Stella bounded up the stairs wearing a custom designer gown paid for with the stolen future of her twin daughters. She looked radiant, intoxicated by the attention and the perceived success of her fake lifestyle brand. She adjusted the microphone stand, her diamond earrings catching the stage lights. She had no idea that she was standing on top of a massive landmine. Stella tapped the microphone twice, sending a sharp thud echoing across the silent ballroom. She flashed a blinding smile to the audience, leaned forward, and proudly thanked her perfect, wealthy, and supportive family. Stella beamed out at the sea of 200 elite guests, her smile perfectly practiced and entirely devoid of genuine emotion. She gripped the microphone stand tightly, her expensive diamond bracelets catching the harsh stage lights and reflecting blinding flashes across the dark room. She spoke at length about her supposedly grueling journey as an entrepreneur, spinning a fabricated, highly rehearsed tale of late nights, endless sacrifices, and relentless dedication to building her luxury lifestyle brand. She painted a vivid picture of a self-made woman who had constructed an empire from the ground up through sheer willpower. It was a spectacular performance of complete delusion. As she reached the emotional climax of her fabricated origin story, she gestured grandly toward the front row. She told the wealthy crowd that absolutely none of her monumental success would have been possible without the unwavering financial and emotional backing of her incredible husband. She called Terrence to the stage, asking everyone to give a massive round of applause for the man who graciously funded her dreams. The grand ballroom erupted into polite, affluent applause. Terrence stood up slowly. He adjusted the cuffs of his pristine black tuxedo with total calm. He did not smile. He did not wave to the clapping audience. He walked up the short flight of stairs to the main stage with the slow, measured, and deliberate pace of a man walking to an execution. He stepped up to the microphone, towering over Stella. She placed a manicured hand on his arm, completely oblivious to the cold, unyielding tension radiating from his entire body. She handed him the microphone, fully expecting him to play the role of the subservient, adoring spouse that he had been forced to play for years. Terrence gripped the microphone. He looked out over the sea of expectant faces. He saw Harold and Barbara standing near the front of the stage, their chests puffed out with unearned pride and arrogance. He looked at the powerful investors, the influential socialites, and the local politicians holding their crystal flutes of expensive champagne. The massive room slowly quieted down, waiting for him to deliver his rehearsed praises and validate his wife's fraudulent narrative. Terrence's voice resonated through the massive ballroom speakers. It was deep, calm, and terrifyingly steady. He started by thanking everyone for coming out tonight to celebrate what Stella described as the culmination of her lifelong dreams. He acknowledged the staggering cost of the elaborate floral arrangements, the custom theatrical lighting, and the top-shelf liquor flowing freely at the open bars. He stated that it truly takes a massive amount of capital to project a flawless image of this magnitude to the public. Then the pivot happened. The subtle shift in his tone sent a sudden palpable chill through the warm room. Terrence looked directly at Harold and Barbara. He announced into the microphone that he had spent the last decade funding not just his wife's endless vanity projects, but the entire fraudulent, decaying lifestyle of her parents. He stated with absolute unwavering clarity that he was officially done. He told the audience that he would no longer act as the personal bank account for a fiercely racist, deeply abusive family that viewed him as nothing more than a convenient ATM. The silence in the ballroom became absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a bomb dropping. Terrence did not raise his voice. The clinical surgical precision of his delivery made his words hit twice as hard. He detailed the endless microaggressions he had endured. He exposed Harold for making vile, bigoted jokes in the very country club they were currently standing in. He exposed Barbara for refusing to acknowledge his African American heritage while gladly spending the money he earned working 80-hour weeks as a pediatrician saving children's lives. Stella's perfect smile shattered into a million pieces. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, watching the horrified, disgusted expressions of her wealthy friends and vital investors. She reached out desperately, trying to grab his arm, whispering frantically for him to stop talking immediately. Terrence ignored her completely. He was just getting started. He turned his dark, intense gaze back to the crowd. He asked the guests to take a good look at the premium champagne they were currently drinking. He told them to look at the imported caviar, the towering ice sculptures, and the custom designer gown his wife was wearing. He revealed the horrifying, undeniable truth behind the funding of Stella's dreams. He announced that just hours ago, his wife had bypassed dual authorization security and secretly forged his signature. He stated that Stella had completely emptied the high-yield college savings accounts he had spent years diligently building for their twin daughters. He told the 200 elite guests that they were currently sipping champagne bought with the stolen future of his children. A collective, audible gasp echoed across the grand ballroom. Several guests instinctively lowered their champagne flutes, suddenly repulsed by the drinks in their hands. Angry whispers erupted like wildfire. The investors Harold had been aggressively courting stared at the stage in absolute disgust. Stella panicked. The polished high society facade she valued more than her own flesh and blood was disintegrating in real time. Her face contorted into an ugly mask of desperation. She lunged forward, clawing frantically at the microphone in Terrence's hand. She shrieked at him to shut up, demanding that someone cut the audio feed immediately. She tried to physically wrestle the heavy metal stand away from him. Terrence did not even flinch. He used his imposing presence to block her effortlessly. He simply shifted his weight, turning his broad shoulder to shield the microphone, rendering her frantic clawing attempts completely useless. He stood like an immovable stone pillar, while she unraveled into a hysterical, thrashing mess right in front of her most important social circle. He refused to yield the floor until his truth was entirely spoken. He looked down at his frantic wife and stated clearly into the microphone that he was terminating this marriage effective immediately. Just as Harold started screaming from the front row, ordering the country club security to intervene and drag Terrence away, a figure moved swiftly from the back of the room. It was David. The elite process server, still perfectly disguised in his crisp white bartender uniform and black bow tie, bypassed the stunned security guards. He walked calmly up the short flight of stairs and stepped directly onto the main stage. David ignored the screaming father and the thrashing wife. He walked straight up to Stella, extending his hand with practiced authority. He pressed a thick, heavy manila envelope firmly against her chest, forcing her to take it. He looked her dead in the eye, his voice carrying clearly over her hysterical sobbing, and delivered the fatal blow. "You have been served." He turned and walked off the stage. The envelope contained the official divorce papers, the demand for full custody of the twin daughters, and an emergency federal injunction freezing every single asset to her name. The heavy manila envelope slipped from Stella's trembling fingers and hit the polished wooden stage with a dull thud. She stared down at the thick stack of legal documents spilling across the floorboards. Her breathing turned into sharp, ragged gasps. The perfectly curated illusion of her luxury lifestyle brand had just been publicly executed. The grand ballroom, previously filled with the polite chatter of high society, descended into absolute pandemonium. Whispers erupted like a shockwave across the sea of elite guests. Champagne flutes were hastily set down on silver trays as the 200 wealthy attendees shifted from supportive investors to horrified spectators. The investors Harold had spent months aggressively courting exchanged alarmed glances, their faces registering the profound financial and public relations disaster unfolding right before their eyes. Terrence did not wait around to watch his soon-to-be ex-wife completely unravel. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket with smooth, effortless dignity, turned his back on Stella, and prepared to walk down the stage steps. His mission was complete. He had reclaimed his freedom, his self-respect, and his financial future in one brilliant, calculated strike. But Harold was not going to let him simply walk away. A roar of pure, unadulterated fury echoed from the front of the ballroom. Harold shoved his way through the crowd of stunned socialites, violently knocking aside a waiter and sending a tray of crystal glasses shattering to the floor. His face was a terrifying shade of deep mottled purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He stormed toward the stage, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed for the country club security to intervene. He demanded that they immediately arrest Terrence. He ordered them to drag the man out of the building and throw him onto the street. The private country club security guards hesitated. They looked from the enraged, screaming patriarch to the calm, imposing pediatrician standing on the stage, completely unsure of how to handle a domestic dispute among their highest-paying members. Their hesitation only fueled Harold's blinding rage. He did not wait for the guards. He stomped heavily up the short flight of wooden stairs, closing the distance between himself and Terrence in 3 massive strides. Harold pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at Terrence's chest. He screamed that Terrence was an ungrateful parasite who had ruined his daughter's life and destroyed his family's impeccable reputation. Terrence stood his ground. He did not flinch, he did not raise his hands, and he did not back away. He simply looked down at Harold with an expression of profound, chilling pity. That look of absolute superiority pushed Harold completely over the edge. The last remaining shred of Harold's carefully manufactured progressive suburban facade instantly evaporated. He lost his temper entirely. He opened his mouth and at the top of his lungs screamed a vile, unforgivable racial slur directly at Terrence. The word echoed through the ballroom, amplified by the high vaulted ceilings. Time seemed to stand perfectly still. The ambient noise of the gala died instantly, replaced by a deafening, horrified silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic collapse. Harold stood panting on the stage, his chest heaving, oblivious for a fraction of a second to the monumental destruction he had just brought upon himself. Then the true fallout began. The gasps from the audience were loud and synchronized. The wealthy progressive business partners Harold relied on to keep his failing company afloat physically recoiled in disgust. These were prominent venture capitalists, local politicians, and philanthropic board members who absolutely despised public scandal. To be associated with a blatant, unhinged racist was corporate suicide. The social execution was instantaneous. Within seconds, glowing rectangular screens illuminated the dark ballroom. Guests eagerly pulled out their smartphones, tapping their camera applications and hitting record. The red recording lights blinked like a swarm of angry fireflies in the dim room. They captured Harold's purple, sweating face. They captured Stella weeping hysterically on the floor amidst her divorce papers. They captured the complete, undeniable collapse of the family's fake empire. This footage would be circulating through every major country club boardroom and social media network in Chicago before the night was over. Harold's reputation was permanently, irrevocably destroyed. Barbara attempted a frantic, doomed effort at damage control. She hiked up her emerald green designer gown and scrambled up the stage steps, grabbing Harold's arm and trying to pull him back from the microphone. She hissed at him to stop talking, realizing too late that the investors were already heading toward the exit doors. She tried to force a panicked, apologetic smile toward the crowd, desperately attempting to laugh off the slur as a misunderstood joke, but her words were completely drowned out by the angry murmurs and the clicking of camera shutters. Her social standing, the very air she breathed, was vaporizing in real time. I watched the entire meltdown from the back of the room, standing perfectly still. The sheer magnitude of their self-destruction was staggering, but my portion of the evening was far from over. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket. I signaled to my 3 hired private security officers. They immediately snapped into formation, creating a wide, impenetrable path through the chaotic crowd. I walked forward. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, cutting through the noise of the panicking guests. I did not rush. I moved with the cold, deliberate authority of a corporate executioner stepping up to the block. The crowd parted willingly, their phone cameras turning to capture my arrival. I climbed the wooden stairs of the main stage, my gaze locked entirely on the people who had starved my son in a freezing laundry room. I reached the center of the stage and stopped right beside Terrence. I gave him a slow, firm nod of profound respect. He had played his part flawlessly. He returned the nod, his posture relaxed, and handed the heavy metal microphone directly to me. I took it, feeling the cool metal in my grip. I looked at Harold, who was suddenly frozen, his eyes widening as he recognized the calm, predatory look on my face. I turned away from my father, looked directly up toward the dark balcony at the back of the ballroom, and raised my hand to signal the audiovisual booth. The technician in the audiovisual booth received my signal perfectly. I had paid him a very generous consulting fee earlier that afternoon to ensure my presentation took absolute priority. The massive LED screen behind the stage flickered. Stella's pretentious gold and white lifestyle brand logo vanished instantly. In its place, a stark, high-contrast financial spreadsheet illuminated the ballroom, casting a harsh blue light over the horrified faces of the wealthy elite. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the cavernous space, entirely stripped of any familial warmth. I introduced myself to the 200 guests, not as Harold and Barbara's daughter, but as a certified fraud examiner. I directed my attention straight to the venture capitalists and prominent investors standing near the front rows. I told them that the man they had been drinking with, the man soliciting their capital for real estate expansion, was currently operating a hollow, decaying shell of a company. I pointed a laser pointer directly at the glowing numbers on the screen. I methodically broke down the anatomy of Harold's financial crimes. I highlighted the routing numbers associated with his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I explained using clinical corporate terminology exactly how he had been systematically skimming profits from his primary business and reporting catastrophic losses to the Internal Revenue Service. I showed the crowd the fake consulting fees he used to launder money directly into Stella's failing business ventures. I announced with absolute clarity that Harold had successfully evaded $1.2 million in federal taxes over the past 7 years. The investors in the room visibly panicked, stepping physically away from Harold, as if his federal crimes were contagious. They immediately realized their own portfolios could be tied to a massive money laundering investigation. Harold completely lost his mind. His face twisted into a mask of feral desperation. He realized his entire kingdom was burning to ash in front of his most important peers. He lunged toward the media console positioned at the side of the stage, his hands grasping frantically for the thick bundle of power cords and HDMI cables. He wanted to physically unplug the projector to hide the evidence of his felonies. He never even made it close. My hired private security detail moved with terrifying speed and precision. The 3 off-duty police officers stepped directly into his path, forming an impenetrable wall of tailored black suits and solid muscle. Harold crashed into the lead officer and bounced off completely powerless. He screamed that I was hacking proprietary corporate information. He threatened to sue me for everything I owned, screaming until his voice cracked. The security officers did not say a word. They simply stood with their arms crossed, effortlessly blocking his path and forcing him to watch his own destruction. I pressed the clicker in my hand, transitioning to the next slide. I exposed the defaulted commercial loans. I showed the crowd that the country club dues, the imported caviar, the designer emerald gown Barbara was wearing, and the vintage champagne they were all drinking were entirely funded by toxic debt. I laid bare the reality that the self-proclaimed titans of suburban high society were completely broke, shuffling money between maxed-out credit lines just to maintain their arrogant illusion. Then I moved to the final slide. The ballroom fell so quiet you could hear the hum of the projector fan. The screen displayed an official, federally flagged credit report. I let the audience read the name at the top of the document. Leo. My voice dropped to a lethal, quiet intensity that commanded absolute attention. I told the room that my parents liked to project an image of pristine morality and family values. I explained that just a few days ago, Barbara had locked my 7-year-old adopted son in a freezing laundry room. I told the horrified crowd that she deliberately starved him for 48 hours, claiming that feeding an orphan was a waste of good organic food. A collective murmur of pure revulsion rippled through the socialite guests. I raised my hand, pointing directly at the damning credit report glowing above me. I told them that while my parents were starving my child, they were actively using his stolen social security number. I broke down the exact charges. I showed them the $40,000 in debt racked up by Stella and Barbara. I listed the purchases out loud: $5,000 at a luxury boutique, $2,000 for a VIP weekend spa retreat, $3,000 in premium catering. They had committed felony identity theft against a first grader to fund the exact party these guests were currently attending. The reaction was visceral. People gasped aloud. Several of Barbara's closest friends covered their mouths in shock, staring at her with unabashed disgust. Stealing from a spouse was a scandal, but starving an adopted child and stealing his identity to buy designer shoes was an unforgivable, sickening crime that transcended all high society gossip. Barbara realized the social execution was absolute. There was no spinning this narrative. There was no manipulating her way out of federal fraud and child endangerment. In a final desperate attempt to stop the presentation and garner sympathy from the hostile crowd, she opted for pure theatrics. She let out a piercing, dramatic wail, clutched her chest with both hands, and collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor. She lay there motionless, pretending to have a sudden life-threatening medical emergency. The room gasped again, and a few people instinctively moved forward to help. But Terrence stepped right up to the edge of the stage, his imposing presence halting anyone from getting too close. He looked down at his mother-in-law, sprawled on the floor. As a highly trained medical professional, he did not rush to her side. He did not call for an ambulance. Instead, Terrence lifted his chin, his voice carrying effortlessly over the anxious murmurs of the ballroom. He loudly announced to the entire room that her breathing was perfectly regular, her color was fine, and she was completely faking it. The entire ballroom watched in stunned fascination as Terrence's medical assessment completely neutralized Barbara's theatrical performance. Harold realized instantly that his wife's pathetic attempt to garner sympathy had failed, leaving him entirely exposed to the unyielding judgment of his wealthy peers. He stepped right over Barbara as she lay on the polished hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking, furious finger up at me. His face was slick with sweat, the veins in his forehead pulsing visibly under the harsh stage lights. He decided that his only remaining defense was to reassert his dominance through the sheer illusion of his material wealth. He raised his voice to a booming, desperate roar, commanding the attention of the horrified investors and socialites in the room. He told the crowd that I was nothing but a vindictive, estranged liar who had spent her entire life jealous of her family's success. He waved his arms frantically, gesturing to the opulent country club surroundings, the towering crystal chandeliers, and the valets parking luxury imported vehicles outside. He screamed that he was completely untouchable. He demanded to know how anyone could possibly believe the fabricated spreadsheets of a bitter accountant over the tangible, undeniable proof of his massive estate. He shouted that a bankrupt man does not live in a sprawling multi-million-dollar compound in the most exclusive zip code of Lake Forest. He bellowed that his majestic home, his successful company, and his elite status were absolute proof of his untouchable wealth, and that I was simply trying to extort him because I could never achieve real power on my own. I did not interrupt him. I stood perfectly still on the main stage, letting him dig his own grave deeper with every arrogant, boastful syllable. I let him tie his entire self, worth his entire public identity, and his entire defense to the physical structure of that suburban mansion. When his voice finally cracked and he stood there panting for breath, I smiled. It was a slow, predatory smile that made the temperature in the ballroom drop. I brought the microphone back to my lips. My voice was calm, resonant, and entirely stripped of mercy. I told him that he certainly loved that house. I acknowledged that his grand columns, the imported marble floors, and the sweeping circular driveway served as the perfect shield. I explained to the captivated audience that his mansion was the ultimate prop, a massive theatrical set piece designed to convince all these intelligent venture capitalists that he was a safe, secure investment. But then I shifted my tone to a clinical corporate precision. I stated that real estate is just paper, and unfortunately for him, his paper was highly toxic. I told Harold that while he stood up here bragging about a multi-million-dollar compound, he conveniently forgot to mention the reality of his liabilities to his elite friends. I revealed that he had not made a single solitary mortgage payment in 9 long months. I explained how he had taken out a massive high-interest commercial loan against his primary residence just to cover the frantic margin calls on his failing business. I told the room that when he inevitably defaulted, his premier bank dropped him immediately, selling his toxic debt to an aggressive shadow hedge fund operating out of New York. I looked right into his panicked eyes and told him he was nothing more than a non-performing asset. Harold's face went entirely slack. The arrogant fire in his chest was extinguished in a fraction of a second. His mouth hung open as his brain short-circuited, entirely unable to process how I possessed the highly classified details of his private hedge fund debt. I paced slowly across the stage, looking down at him. I explained to the wealthy crowd that institutional hedge funds absolutely despise non-performing assets because a lengthy, expensive public foreclosure process ruins their quarterly profit margins. I stated that when a highly motivated debt acquisition firm calls a portfolio manager and offers to buy a toxic residential mortgage for pennies on the dollar in pure liquid cash, the hedge fund does not hesitate to sign the transfer of lien. I stopped pacing and stood directly above him. I reached inside the interior pocket of my tailored designer suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, meticulously folded stack of heavy legal documents. I looked out at the 200 guests and formally introduced myself. I announced that I was not just a certified fraud examiner. I revealed that I was the sole managing member and CEO of Apex Recovery, LLC, the exact financial firm that had purchased his defaulted mortgage directly from the hedge fund just a few hours ago. I looked back down at Harold. He was trembling now, his knees buckling under the catastrophic weight of my words. I held the official deed of trust and the expedited foreclosure notice out over the edge of the stage. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow. I told him that he did not own a mansion. I did. I opened my fingers and let the documents fall. The heavy white papers fluttered through the air and landed right on the polished hardwood floor at his feet. Harold stared down at the official county seals as if the papers were actively burning the floorboards. He was entirely paralyzed. Barbara, miraculously cured of her fake fainting spell, scrambled up from the ground. Her emerald designer gown was wrinkled, her perfect hair in disarray. She snatched the documents from the floor with shaking hands. She read the transfer of lien. She read the bold print of Apex Recovery, LLC. She read my authorized digital signature at the bottom of the deed. The devastating realization hit them both with the destructive force of a freight train. The ultimate symbol of their superiority, the pristine suburban castle, where they had deliberately starved my 7-year-old son, now legally belonged to the woman they had spent their entire lives treating like garbage. They were entirely at my mercy, and they knew I had none left to give. Barbara began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as the high society facade completely shattered. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with genuine primal terror. The wealthy matriarch was suddenly just a terrified homeless woman standing in a rented ballroom. I looked down at my mother, my voice echoing through the silent room with absolute unforgivable finality. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property before I have the sheriff throw your belongings onto the street. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. Barbara stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without sound, the crushing reality of her impending homelessness finally penetrating her delusion. Harold stood rigid on the polished stage, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors. The wealthy investors who had previously hung on his every word now looked at him as though he were a biological hazard. They were silently calculating their own exposure, terrified that their proximity to his toxic empire would trigger federal audits. Then the piercing wail of approaching sirens shattered the quiet. The sound started as a distant scream and rapidly amplified, echoing fiercely off the manicured golf courses. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, brilliant flashes of red and blue lights began to strobe, slicing through the darkness outside and illuminating the crystal chandeliers with the frantic colors of an emergency response. The heavy oak double doors of the main entrance burst open. A coordinated task force poured into the grand foyer. Leading the charge were agents wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They were flanked by uniformed officers from the local police department. They moved with uncompromising authority, bypassing the panicked country club staff and marching directly into the main VIP ballroom. The lead federal agent, a tall man clutching a thick folder of arrest warrants, raised his voice above the rising panic. He ordered everyone to remain calm and step back. My hired private security detail immediately shifted formation, creating a wide corridor for the authorities to approach the main stage. The elite guests scrambled to get out of the way, dropping their expensive champagne flutes. The lead agent stepped up to the edge of the wooden stage. He looked directly at my father and loudly identified himself. He stated he was executing multiple federal search warrants for the business holdings of Harold and the personal residential estate in Lake Forest. He then turned his attention to Barbara, announcing that local authorities were simultaneously acting on felony warrants regarding severe financial crimes. Harold completely lost whatever remained of his manufactured composure. The corporate titan, who had spent the last 2 hours screaming about his untouchable wealth, suddenly shrank into a cornered, terrified coward. The moment the federal agent stepped onto the stage, the illusion of their family unity disintegrated entirely. Harold took one look at the federal badges and immediately pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at his wife. He screamed that Barbara handled all household finances. He bellowed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with desperation that he knew absolutely nothing about the $40,000 credit card debt. He shouted that Barbara was the one who stole the 7-year-old orphan's social security number. He told the federal agents she was a compulsive spender, a manipulative liar, and forged all documents to fund her lavish lifestyle. He threw the woman he had been married to for 35 years under the bus without hesitation. Barbara's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The shock of her husband's instant betrayal ignited a vicious, feral rage. She lunged toward him, her designer emerald gown tangling around her legs. She screamed that Harold was a pathetic, incompetent failure who drove his own company into the ground. She shrieked that he was the one who ordered her to open fraudulent credit lines because his offshore bank accounts were frozen. She turned to the IRS agents, pointing frantically at Harold. She offered to hand over every hidden ledger, offshore routing number, and fake consulting invoice. She told the authorities Harold orchestrated the massive tax evasion scheme and forced her to sign the joint returns under immense duress. Stella, clutching her divorce papers and realizing she was going down with the sinking ship, decided to join the cannibalism. She scrambled backward, putting physical distance between herself and her parents. She cried out to the police officers, her voice a hysterical whine. She claimed she was just an innocent victim. She blamed Harold for funding her lifestyle brand with dirty, laundered money, insisting she had no idea the capital was stolen from the federal government. Then she turned on Barbara, screaming her mother was the one who suggested stealing Leo's identity to pay for gala catering. Stella wept, begging the officers to believe that her parents manipulated her into accepting fraudulent funds. I stood silently on the stage next to Terrence, watching the grotesque spectacle unfold. The absolute loyalty they had violently demanded from me my entire life never actually existed between themselves. Their family bond was nothing more than a fragile alliance of convenience held together by stolen money and a shared superiority complex. The moment they faced actual severe consequences, They tore each other to pieces like starving wolves, fighting over a scrap of meat. Terence looked down at the screaming family members, his posture rigid, but his eyes filled with profound validation. He leaned toward me and quietly stated they were finally showing the rest of the world the monsters they had always been behind closed doors. The federal agents and local police officers heard enough of the mutual incrimination. The lead IRS investigator gave a decisive nod. Uniformed officers moved in surrounding Harold and Barbara. They grabbed Harold's arms, forcing them roughly behind his back. The loud metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing across the silent ballroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Another officer secured Barbara's wrists, ignoring her hysterical sobbing and frantic pleas for mercy. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a small card from his tactical vest. He looked Harold and Barbara directly in the eyes. His voice cut through the chaos, cold and authoritative, as he formally read them, their Miranda rights for felony identity theft and federal tax fraud. The lead agent finished reading the Miranda rights, the harsh syllables echoing in the cavernous ballroom. The reality of the words seemed to physically crush Harold. The blustering corporate titan, who had spent decades intimidating everyone in his path, simply hollowed out. His shoulders slumped forward, and the fight completely drained from his eyes. Two uniformed officers gripped him by the elbows and forcefully guided him down the center aisle of the country club. The wealthy investors and socialites parted like the Red Sea, pressing themselves against the linen-draped tables to avoid any accidental contact with a newly minted federal criminal. Harold dragged his feet across the imported rugs, staring blankly at the floor, a completely broken man. Barbara, however, refused to go quietly. As the arresting officer tugged on her arm, the sheer terror of her impending incarceration finally overwhelmed her pride. She twisted violently, her expensive emerald green designer gown snagging on the edge of a stray chair. The sudden movement threw her off balance. She stumbled forward, the heavy steel handcuffs restricting her ability to catch herself. She crashed heavily onto her knees right at the base of the wooden stage where I was standing. The impact sent a jarring thud through the floorboards. She did not try to stand back up. Instead, she stayed on her knees looking up at me from the ground. The pristine, untouchable matriarch was entirely destroyed. Her elaborate hairstyle was ruined, loose strands clinging to her sweat-slicked forehead. Thick, dark streaks of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, mixing with her hysterical, panicked tears. She was sobbing so forcefully that she could barely catch her breath. The remaining high society guests watched in absolute morbid fascination as the woman who had judged them all so harshly was reduced to a pathetic, groveling spectacle. Barbara strained against the officer's grip, throwing her head back and wailing my name. Her voice was a ragged, desperate screech that pierced the tense silence of the ballroom. She begged me to call off the federal agents. She screamed that we were family. She sobbed the words tearing from her throat in a frantic, disjointed plea. She reminded me that she gave birth to me, that she raised me, and that I simply could not let them do this to her. She pleaded for mercy, demanding that I use my money and my connections to fix the catastrophe unfolding around her. She cried out that she would do anything I wanted, that she would pay me back every single cent if I would just tell the police to release her. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I stood at the edge of the stage, looking down at the woman who had locked my sweet, innocent 7-year-old son in a freezing laundry room. I looked at the woman who had deliberately starved a child for 48 hours and then stolen his identity to buy the very shoes she was currently wearing. I slowly bent my knees, crouching down until my face was perfectly level with hers. The police officer held her firmly in place, ensuring she could not lunge at me. I looked directly into her bloodshot, terrified eyes. The panicked noise of the ballroom faded away, leaving only the cold, empty space between us. I kept my voice incredibly low, perfectly steady, and completely devoid of any human warmth. I made sure every single syllable landed with maximum calculated destruction. I told her that she was just a visitor in my life now. I stated clearly that she was not my family. I looked at her tear-stained face, and delivered the final undeniable truth. I told her it would be a complete waste of energy to care about her. Barbara gasped, as if I had driven a physical blade directly into her chest. The words hit her with the devastating precise force of a returning boomerang. She recognized her own cruel phrasing instantly. The realization that her own malicious actions had sealed her ultimate fate paralyzed her. The hysterical sobbing stopped, replaced by a hollow, breathless shock. She simply stared at me, her eyes wide and vacant, completely broken by the absolute finality of my rejection. I stood back up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket. I did not say another word to her. I turned my back on the woman who gave birth to me and walked away without a single backward glance. I signaled to my private security detail. They immediately formed a protective wedge around me and Terrence. We walked together off the side of the stage, bypassing the chaotic scene in the center of the room. I felt lighter than I had in 34 years. The toxic chains that had bound me to that abusive household were permanently severed. Behind me, I heard the police officers hauling Barbara to her feet and dragging her toward the flashing red and blue lights waiting outside the grand double doors. While Harold and Barbara were being shoved into the back of separate squad cars, Stella remained frozen near the catering tables. The golden child was entirely abandoned. She clutched the heavy manila envelope containing her divorce papers to her chest like a shield. She looked around the ballroom, her eyes darting frantically. The wealthy guests she had invited to launch her fake luxury brand were whispering and pointing at her. The investors were already dialing their legal teams. She had no husband to fund her delusions, no parents to launder money for her, and her social standing was completely annihilated. Panic consumed her. She needed to escape the suffocating judgment of the crowd. She needed to get back to the safety of her least luxury vehicle and hide. She hiked up the skirt of her custom designer gown, shoved past a group of staring socialites, and bolted for the main exit. She burst through the heavy country club doors and sprinted out into the cool, crisp night air. She ran frantically down the grand stone steps, her high heels clicking erratically against the pavement as she headed straight toward the VIP valet parking lot. She reached into her designer clutch, her hands shaking violently as she searched for her electronic key fob. She looked up, expecting to see her pristine top-of-the-line SUV waiting for her under the bright parking lot lights. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks. A massive heavy-duty tow truck was backed into her VIP parking space. Warning lights flashed amber across the asphalt. A burly repossession agent in a reflective vest was actively ratcheting heavy steel chains around the front axles of her prized vehicle. The mechanical whine of the hydraulic winch echoed through the parking lot as the front tires of her luxury SUV were lifted off the ground. Stella screamed, dropping her clutch in utter defeat, but the repo man simply locked the winch, climbed into his heavy cab, and drove her last remaining status symbol completely out of sight, leaving her utterly alone in the cold dark. The Sunday morning sun streamed through my apartment kitchen windows, casting a warm glow across the granite countertops. The sheer quiet of my home felt like an absolute triumph. There were no screaming matches, no passive-aggressive remarks, and no toxic manipulation polluting the air. I stood at the stove pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I flipped a golden brown pancake on the cast-iron skillet, smiling as the sweet smell of vanilla filled the room. Leo sat at the kitchen island, his legs kicking happily against the wooden stool. He was wearing superhero pajamas, eagerly waiting for breakfast. I slid a stack of fluffy pancakes onto his plate, adding fresh blueberries. He beamed up at me, his dark eyes sparkling with pure joy. I kissed the top of his head, feeling profound security. We were finally safe. I picked up my tablet and sipped my coffee. The digital world outside was exploding. Local Chicago news outlets abandoned their regular programming to focus entirely on the raid at the elite country club. The headlines were relentless. Corporate titan arrested in massive IRS fraud sweep. Socialite dragged from luxury gala in handcuffs. Social media was a different level of chaotic execution. The footage from the ballroom captured by dozens of wealthy guests had gone viral. I scrolled through the trending feeds. There was Harold screaming at the federal agents. There was Barbara sobbing hysterically on the hardwood floor begging for mercy. There was Stella clutching her divorce papers while her leased luxury vehicle was towed into the dark night. The digital public square was tearing their fake image to shreds. Every lie they told was exposed. My secure cell phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed Terrence. I answered the call walking over to the window to watch the morning traffic. His voice came through the speaker carrying a deep tone of unparalleled exhaustion. But beneath that exhaustion was an unmistakable current of pure relief. He sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for a decade and was finally allowed to inhale. I asked him how his morning was going. He let out a rich, genuine laugh. He told me he was sitting on the balcony of a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago, drinking premium coffee, while his twin daughters sat safely inside on a king-sized bed, happily eating room service waffles and watching cartoons. Terrence told me his ruthless divorce attorney successfully filed the emergency custody orders first thing this morning, leveraging the public arrest of their grandparents and the financial devastation of their mother. Stella was completely locked out legally and financially. Terrence expressed his profound gratitude. He told me that for the first time since he married into that toxic nightmare, he felt like a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He did not have to pretend anymore. He did not have to fund the delusions of a racist, abusive family. We shared a quiet, grounding moment of mutual respect over the phone. We agreed to touch base later in the week and ended the call with a solidified sense of chosen family loyalty. I walked back to the kitchen island to pour another cup of coffee. Right as I picked up the glass carafe, my phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed an unknown local Chicago area code. I rarely answer unknown numbers, but my forensic instincts told me exactly what this was. I swiped the screen to accept the call and brought the device to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited. A frantic, overly polished voice immediately launched into a rapid-fire legal pitch. The man introduced himself as a senior partner at a high-priced criminal defense firm. He stated he had been retained on emergency retainer by Harold and Barbara, who were currently sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting their initial bail hearings. The defense attorney did not try to intimidate me. He knew I held all the leverage. Instead, he attempted a pathetic negotiation. He begged me to consider a private civil settlement regarding the $40,000 credit card debt. He pleaded with me to officially drop the felony identity theft charges against my parents. He claimed that the federal tax evasion charges were already enough to ruin them, and adding the malicious identity theft of a minor would guarantee them maximum security prison sentences. He tried to use family mercy as leverage, suggesting that a daughter surely would not want to see her aging parents die behind federal bars. I stood in my warm kitchen, looking over at my beautiful 7-year-old son, who was happily eating his breakfast. I remembered the freezing laundry room. I remembered the 2 days of deliberate starvation. I remembered the absolute lack of mercy they had shown an innocent orphan. I did not argue with the frantic defense attorney. I did not debate the legal merits of the case. I did not even offer him a single syllable of negotiation. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear, tapped the red button to terminate the call, and permanently blocked the number. They were going to face the absolute maximum federal penalty for every single crime they committed against my son. I set my phone face down on the granite counter. I looked up at the digital clock mounted on the stainless steel microwave. The bold red numbers glowed brightly, marking the passage of time. The 48-hour eviction notice I had dropped onto the stage floor last night was actively ticking down. Harold and Barbara were locked in federal custody, and Stella was completely broke and legally paralyzed. The sprawling Lake Forest mansion was currently sitting empty, unguarded, and legally mine. I walked back into my home office and booted up my secure laptop. I needed to ensure the physical seizure of the property was absolute and uncontested. I bypassed standard real estate agents and located a highly specialized property clean-out crew. These were tactical professionals hired by major banks to clear out foreclosed estates. I dialed their dispatch number, ready to instruct them to haul every piece of fake luxury garbage my parents owned straight to the local landfill. I finalized the contract with the tactical cleanout crew, paid their exorbitant emergency retainer, and closed my laptop. The 48 hours ticked by with agonizing slowness, but I utilized every single second to prepare for the physical seizure of my new property. When the legal deadline officially expired on Tuesday morning, I did not drive to the Lake Forest mansion alone. I drove straight to the local sheriff's precinct. As the legal owner and CEO of Apex Recovery LLC, I possessed the absolute right to secure my investment. I presented the executed foreclosure documents and the expedited eviction notice to the desk sergeant. Within 20 minutes, I was pulling into the sweeping circular driveway of my childhood prison, flanked by two armed sheriff deputies in a marked patrol cruiser. The sprawling brick estate looked exactly as imposing as it always had, but the energy surrounding it was completely dead. The expensive imported cars were gone. The meticulously manicured lawn felt hollow. Harold and Barbara were currently rotting in a federal holding cell downtown. Without access to their frozen bank accounts, they had absolutely no way to post bail. The corporate titans who once threw lavish charity galas were now trading their tailored suits for standard-issue jail jumpsuits, waiting for federal prosecutors to tear them apart. That left only one person remaining inside the house. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The sheriff deputies walked in right behind me, their hands resting casually on their duty belts. The interior of the mansion was a scene of absolute pathetic chaos. The illusion of high society perfection was entirely shattered. Overstuffed cardboard boxes, half-filled garbage bags, and piles of wrinkled designer clothing littered the imported marble floors. Standing in the middle of the ruined living room was Stella. The golden child looked completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, greasy mess. She was wearing stained sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, frantically shoving expensive purses into a cracked plastic tote bin. When she heard our footsteps, she spun around, her eyes wide and bloodshot from days of nonstop crying and sheer panic. Terrence had successfully frozen every single dime of her marital assets, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. Stella dropped a designer handbag onto the floor and stared at me. She looked from my tailored business suit to the two uniformed deputies standing at my shoulders. Her face contorted into a pathetic, desperate mask. She did not yell or scream like she had at the gala. The reality of her total destruction had finally broken her arrogance. She took a step toward me, her hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. She begged me to call off the police. She told me she had nowhere to go, no money for a hotel, and no friends willing to answer her phone calls after the disaster at the country club. I stood perfectly still, letting her grovel. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. I simply watched the woman who had laughed while my son was starved reduce herself to begging. Stella dropped to her knees amidst the scattered boxes. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her blotchy face. She pleaded with me to let her stay in the guest house. She pointed toward the backyard, sobbing that the pool house was completely separate from the main mansion, and I would not even know she was there. She tried to invoke the very family bond she had weaponized her entire life. She cried out that she was my sister, that we shared the same blood, and that I owed her this one tiny shred of mercy, because family is supposed to help family. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. I reached inside my leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp white legal document. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, measured authority of a property owner addressing a squatter. I told Stella that I did not owe her anything. I reminded her that when my 7-year-old son needed basic human decency, she demanded I pay $500 to attend her fake luxury party. I told her that blood does not excuse abuse, and it certainly does not grant her a free pass to live on my real estate. I stepped forward and dropped the document right onto the pile of her wrinkled clothes. I informed her that she had been officially served with a formal trespassing notice. I looked at the two sheriff deputies and gave them a curt, professional nod. The deputies stepped forward immediately. They instructed Stella to stand up and vacate the premises. Stella began to wail hysterically, thrashing her arms as the officers took her by the elbows. They did not use excessive force, but they were firm and unyielding. They marched the golden child out of the grand living room, dragged her through the marble foyer, and escorted her right out the front door. I walked out onto the front porch and watched as they guided her down the sweeping driveway, forcing her to drag her single plastic tote bin behind her. She stumbled toward the main road, completely exiled from the suburban kingdom she once ruled. A commercial van pulled into the driveway just as Stella disappeared down the street. The professional locksmith I had hired stepped out carrying heavy toolboxes. I directed him to every single exterior entry point of the massive estate. I stood in the doorway and watched as he methodically removed the expensive brass deadbolts, unscrewed the digital keypads, and completely stripped the old hardware from the heavy wood. He installed brand new maximum security locks on the front door, the back patio, the garage entry, and the pool house. When he finished, he handed me a single shining set of silver keys. I closed the heavy mahogany front door and turned the new deadbolt. The loud metallic click echoed through the empty grand foyer. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my life. The physical locking of the door was the ultimate undeniable symbol of my victory. I had permanently locked out my abusers. They could never return to this sanctuary. They could never use this home to project their false superiority. The fortress that had housed their racism, their cruelty, and their massive financial fraud was now sealed completely shut. I stood alone in the center of the echoing mansion, breathing in the quiet, peaceful air of my newly acquired asset. I did not want to live in this house. The walls held too many toxic memories, and the sheer size of the estate was a massive liability. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and found the direct number for the most ruthless high-end commercial realtor in the greater Chicago area. I hit dial. When the broker answered, I skipped the pleasantries. I told him I had a multi-million-dollar Lake Forest estate ready for immediate listing. I instructed him to price the property slightly below the current market value. I did not care about maximizing the profit margin. I wanted a lightning-fast, aggressive cash close. 6 months passed in a blur of relentless legal retribution and profound personal healing. The federal justice system moves with terrifying efficiency when presented with a fully documented dossier of corporate fraud. Harold and Barbara never stood a chance. Their high-priced defense attorneys abandoned them the moment the retainer funds dried up, leaving them at the mercy of overworked public defenders. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse and watched the sentencing with a heart completely free of pity. Harold was convicted of multiple counts of felony tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. The judge handed down a severe sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary, ignoring his arrogant pleas for leniency. For her direct role in the identity theft of a minor and her complicity in the offshore accounts, Barbara received 5 years. The Internal Revenue Service seized every hidden asset, slapped them with millions in punitive fines, and eradicated their names from Chicago high society. The pristine, untouchable titans were reduced to federal inmate numbers. Stella experienced her own spectacular downfall. Terrence executed his divorce proceedings with the exact same clinical precision we used to dismantle her parents. The family court judge was disgusted by her theft of her own daughter's college funds. Terrence was granted full, undivided primary custody of the twins. Stella was ordered to pay crippling court-mandated restitution to replenish the educational accounts. Without Harold's laundered money to fund her delusions, the fake luxury lifestyle brand collapsed instantly. The last time I heard her name, a mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing the former golden child working the cash register at a discount retail store in a strip mall. She was wearing a cheap polyester uniform and scanning barcodes for minimum wage just to meet her monthly payments to Terrence. The poetic justice of her standing behind a retail counter serving the very people she used to mock was the perfect conclusion to her arrogant charade. With the toxic elements of my bloodline eradicated, I finally had the safe space required to resolve my own internal trauma. I spent those 6 months working intensely with a therapist, untangling the massive web of emotional abuse I had endured since childhood. It was a grueling process to look back at the decades of gaslighting and acknowledge how deeply they had conditioned me to chase an approval that was never going to come. I had spent my adult life building a fortress of professional success and financial security, subconsciously hoping that one day they would look at me and finally admit I was good enough. But as I sat in my peaceful apartment watching my son thrive in a home free of cruel comparisons, I realized the ultimate truth. I officially let go of the ghost of my parents' approval. I did not need it. Their validation was a worthless currency printed by bankrupt souls. Relinquishing the desperate need to be loved by people incapable of love was the most liberating breath I had ever taken. The heavy chain that tied my self-worth to their moving goalposts snapped completely. I was a brilliant forensic accountant. I was a fiercely protective mother. I was a survivor who had meticulously burned an abusive empire to the ground to protect my child. I was more than enough entirely on my own. That evening, I walked into Leo's bedroom. He was sitting on his bed, carefully drawing a picture of our family. I sat down next to him and pulled him into a warm, secure embrace. He rested his head against my shoulder, his breathing steady and calm. He asked me, his voice quiet and curious, why we never saw his grandparents or his aunt anymore. I did not lie to him. I looked directly into his beautiful dark eyes and told him the absolute truth. I told Leo that sometimes the people who are supposed to take care of you are broken inside, and their brokenness makes them do cruel things. I explained that family is absolutely never defined by sharing the same blood or having the same last name. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but filled with fierce conviction. I assured him that a real family is built entirely on love, unwavering protection, and making each other feel safe every single day. I told him that anyone who makes him feel hungry, scared, or unwanted has absolutely no right to be in his life, no matter what society calls them. I brushed a tear from my own cheek, smiled brightly, and told my sweet, brave boy that adopting him was the absolute best thing that ever happened to me. I told him he was my greatest treasure, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure he always knew how deeply he was loved. Leo hugged me back with all his might, the lingering shadows of the laundry room permanently banished from his heart. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place exactly 1 week later. My secure phone rang with a call from the high-end commercial realtor I had hired to liquidate the Lake Forest estate. The aggressive below-market pricing strategy had worked flawlessly. The sprawling brick mansion had sparked a massive bidding war among eager corporate buyers. The realtor enthusiastically informed me that the sale had officially closed. The title was cleanly transferred, and the buyer had wired the final purchase amount in pure liquid cash directly into the holding accounts of Apex Recovery, LLC. I opened my laptop and stared at the staggering influx of capital. The money my parents had used to terrorize me was now entirely under my control. I immediately transferred a massive portion of the profit to my estate lawyer. I instructed him to establish an ironclad, impenetrable trust fund for Leo, ensuring his college tuition, medical care, and future housing were permanently guaranteed against any disaster. Then I selected the transfer destination for the remaining millions. I typed in the exact routing numbers for the state foster care system where I had first met Leo. I wired every single remaining cent of Harold and Barbara's liquidated empire to fund new facilities, specialized medical care, and educational resources for thousands of abandoned children, ensuring my parents' stolen wealth would be used to save the very lives they despised. Exactly 1 year after the gavel came down in federal court, the afternoon sun cast a warm golden haze over the lush green grass of my own backyard. The air was thick with the rich, savory smoke of hickory wood and roasting barbecue. It was the kind of perfect, breezy summer day that felt like an absolute reward for surviving the darkest winter of my life. There were no imported crystal chandeliers here. There were no pretentious waiters carrying silver trays of caviar, and no fake smiles hiding malicious calculating agendas. Instead, there was just the chaotic, beautiful, authentic symphony of pure joy. I stood on my wooden deck, silver grilling tongs in one hand and iced tea in the other, watching the absolute best part of my new reality unfold right in front of me. Leo darted across the vibrant lawn, his sneakers tearing through the grass as he let out a shrieking, breathless laugh. Hot on his heels were Terrence's twin daughters, their braided hair bouncing wildly as they chased my son in a ruthless game of tag. Leo dodged behind a massive oak tree, successfully evading capture, and the girls collapsed onto the lawn, giggling uncontrollably. The sound of their shared laughter was a profound healing balm. It completely washed away the lingering ghosts of that freezing laundry room. These children were not separated by biological status or subjected to cruel hierarchies. They were just kids, safe, cherished, and entirely free to be completely happy. Terrence walked out onto the deck through the sliding glass doors carrying a large tray of marinated vegetables and freshly baked cornbread. He wore a simple faded athletic shirt and comfortable shorts, looking vastly different from the rigid, exhausted man who used to force himself into tailored tuxedos to appease his racist in-laws. The heavy, suffocating burden of Harold and Barbara's constant microaggressions was permanently erased from his posture. He set the tray down on the wooden prep table, picked up a cold bottle of sparkling water, and leaned against the wooden railing right beside me. We watched our children play standing shoulder to shoulder in a comfortable, companionable silence that only comes from surviving a massive war together. Terrence took a sip of his water, his dark eyes tracking his daughters as they tackled Leo in a gentle, rolling hug on the grass. He looked over at me, a profound sense of gratitude softening his strong features. He told me that he still wakes up some mornings bracing himself for an incoming crisis, fully expecting his phone to ring with demands for money or social performances. I nodded, understanding that lingering phantom anxiety perfectly. I told him that trauma leaves a heavy footprint, but the best part about building a fortress is knowing that the enemies are permanently locked outside. Terrence raised his glass, the condensation dripping down the sides in the summer heat. He looked at me, his voice carrying the deep, resonant weight of absolute sincerity. He proposed a toast not to the past we survived, but to the reality we successfully engineered from the ashes. He told me that blood might dictate who brought us into this world, but we alone possess the absolute power to decide who stays in it. He clinked his glass gently against mine, offering a heartfelt toast to our chosen family. I repeated the words back to him, savoring the profound truth they carried. We acknowledged the agonizing pain of the past, the severe, undeniable grief of mourning people who were still alive, but too toxic to keep, and we consciously chose to celebrate the unshakable, hard-won peace of the present. I turned away from the grill and looked directly out at the horizon, realizing that my journey was no longer just about my own survival. It was a blueprint for anyone currently suffocating in the dark. I stepped forward, speaking directly to every single person who has ever been made to feel utterly worthless by the exact people obligated to protect them. Listen to me carefully. The world will constantly try to force a toxic narrative down your throat. Society will relentlessly demand that you forgive the unforgivable simply because the perpetrators happen to share your DNA. They will weaponize the concept of family to keep you trapped in a cycle of endless abuse, financial exploitation, and emotional starvation. Reject that narrative completely. You do not owe your abusers loyalty. You do not owe them your resources, and you absolutely do not owe them your peace of mind. Financial independence is not just about buying nice things. It is the ultimate impenetrable armor against manipulation. When you control your own assets, you control your own destiny. You strip your abusers of their most potent weapon, which is the threat of your destitution. Work ruthlessly to secure your own capital. Protect your credit, safeguard your bank accounts, and never under any circumstances allow an abusive relative to leverage your financial survival. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the most fundamental act of self-preservation. Brutal, unforgiving boundaries are absolutely necessary when dealing with chronic abusers. Do not negotiate with terrorists who use family guilt as a hostage tactic. Sever the ties with surgical, unfeeling precision. Walking away from a toxic bloodline is the most terrifying, agonizing, and liberating decision you will ever make in your entire life. You will mourn the parents you deserved but never had, and then you will wake up one morning and realize you are finally breathing clean air. You are the architect of your own sanctuary. Take back your power, lock the doors against the monsters, and never look back at the people who broke you. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe for more stories of taking back your power. The harrowing narrative of a mother protecting her adopted son from the cruelty of her biological parents illuminates a profound, often uncomfortable truth. Blood relation does not inherently equate to family. For decades, societal expectations have pushed the damaging narrative that we must forgive and endure toxic behavior simply because we share DNA with our abusers. The core lesson here is that true family is defined by unwavering protection, respect, and unconditional love, not by a shared last name. When those who are supposed to nurture you instead exploit your resources and actively harm the people you cherish most, the biological contract is permanently broken. The protagonist's ultimate victory was not just in the brilliant, calculated dismantling of her abuser's financial empire. It was in the realization that she had the absolute power to redefine her own family tree. She learned that setting brutal, uncompromising boundaries is not an act of malice, but an act of profound self-preservation and fierce maternal devotion. By walking away from the toxic illusion of her childhood home, she created a genuine, thriving sanctuary for her son. This teaches us that cutting ties with abusive relatives is never a failure, but rather a courageous reclamation of our own self-worth. We must stop setting ourselves on fire just to keep our abusers warm. Financial independence and emotional clarity give us the necessary tools to lock out those who drain our peace, allowing us to cultivate a beautiful, chosen family, composed entirely of individuals who truly value our well-being. Ultimately, this story empowers us to stop waiting for toxic people to change and to start actively building our own fortresses of peace.